Hello and welcome, folks. I think we're going to get started. My name is Ali Reza Dustar. I am faculty co-director of the Marty Center for the Public Understanding of Religion with my colleague, Professor Wilhelmine Otten. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome this afternoon Reverend Dr. Gary Mason, the founder of Rethinking Conflict. Reverend Dr. Mason spent 28 years as a Methodist minister in Belfast and was involved in bringing peace to Northern Ireland. He has been and continues to be a close advisor to Protestant ex-combatants on the civilianization efforts of paramilitaries. Reverend Dr. Mason is a senior research fellow at the Kennedy Institute for Conflict Intervention at Maynooth University in Ireland, and an adjunct professor at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta. He'll be drawing on his many years of experience this afternoon to share some insights with us from the long war and fragile peace in Ireland. And joining Reverend Dr. Mason in this conversation will be our own Bray Lascota, Executive Director of the Marty Center for the Public Understanding of Religion. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Dr. Mason.
Gary, I'm delighted to have you at the University of Chicago, I think for the first time.
Yeah, first time, it is.
And so I'd like to start, not everybody is familiar with the context of the conflict in Northern Ireland, but if you could give us a sense of what it was like for you to grow up in a life permeated by conflict in Belfast.
Yes, I guess like many people of my generation, interestingly last night, Bria, I was doing a dialogue with Israelis and Palestinians and British and Irish in my context, and the person that was leading it was looking at design thinking and asked us to come up with a kind of 6-word strapline in the middle of all this, so I kind of did something like, born in conflict, devoted to living. And everyone had their own kind of perspectives on that, but I mean, I was very much a child of conflict, growing up in a very segregated society. You don't need a long lecture on Irish history tonight, but I mean, we could go back to the 12th century. I mean, suffice to say, from the 16th or 17th century, there's literally been some form of rebellion, uprising every 40 to 50 years. Northern Ireland as a state, and even the words you use, was it created or was the island partitioned? I often say this in the American context. Was it the Civil War, or was it the War of Northern Aggression? Was it the War of Independence, or was it the Nakba? So we all put our own kind of different perspectives on how these spaces in which we live in were actually created. Probably the best way, Brie, to contextualize my life is just to tell a story of 3 young boys. I mean, I was born into that sort of British Protestant unionist tradition. And I often tell the story of 3 young boys growing up, late 60s, early 70s, normal kids like any kid in Chicago. 2 of those boys went to religious Sunday school together, and another 2 went to primary school together from age 4 to age 11. One of those boys is now dead. He was killed in a terrorist feud in the early 1980s. And the other boy served a life sentence of 18 years, literally slit someone ear to ear, dumped their body in a back alley. And I end up the 3rd boy who ends up a Methodist clergy person. I often tell that story primarily because there were many men, and it was primarily men, and some women of my generation made choices. So I didn't make a choice to pursue, was it freedom fighters? Or was it political violence, or was it terrorism? But I saw many people of my generation make that choice. As one person who was involved in political violence, Bree said, someone in the late 1960s did not fly over Northern Ireland, spray us all with lunatic gas, and we all woke up one day and said, let's start killing each other. There was a context that allowed people to act in very, very different ways. And I often remind people, Bree, I mean, statistically, I'll drill into this in a minute, we had 30,000 people out of a pretty tiny population went through our penal system. They've all now been released under the Good Friday Agreement and other systems that allowed them to be released. Only 2% have reoffended. So out of those 30,000 people, while I fundamentally disagree with what they did, I think it's a rather simplistic view just to say they were all natural serial killers or psychopaths. Someone made those people react in ways, and I would argue because of centuries, not years, centuries of toxic politics and toxic religion that shaped people's minds in very, very different ways.
There's a lot that is there. But that gives the context for how maybe the uncommon choice you made to pursue peace-building work. But can you drill a little bit more into the scale of the conflict, right? So it's not something that a lot of people, especially in the United States, because the Good Friday Accords exists, it seems like a conflict that is done and over. But at one time, it was one of the hottest conflicts in the world.
Yeah. And I wish it was over. We'll eventually get to the dreaded Brexit, I imagine, at some time in this conversation. I mean, as my wife Joyce knows, I was on with a very good colleague, a former archbishop, and another leading academic this morning, painfully talking about that. I mean, Northern Ireland's a very, very tiny space. Population 1.7 million. I mean, it wouldn't even make a major American city. So it's a very tiny space, and just highlighting there were, over that 30-year period, we had 47,000 injuries, 36,000 shootings, 22,000 armed robberies, 16,000 bombings, and almost 4,000 dead. I try to extrapolate those figures to help people in the United States understand the scale of it. And so very simply put, if my conflict had have happened in your space, over a 30-year period, you would have had 700,000 dead, 9 million injuries, 6 million political prisoners, 7 million shootings, and 3 million bombings. So, I mean, suffice to say, Bree, when I'm back home on the island of Ireland, primarily, most of the time I'm dealing with legacy, dealing with the past, and trying to reconfigure that. I mean, the Good Friday Agreement we'll get on to, but I often say to American colleagues, I mean, it was probably one of the most successful pieces of American foreign policy in the last 50 years. But George Mitchell, as many of you know, who chaired that agreement, prophetically said, this coming Sunday, April the 10th, which is also my wedding anniversary, Mitchell said, if you think getting this agreement was difficult, implementing it will be even more difficult. So, Bree, here we are, 24 years after the Good Friday Agreement, we still have not got the architecture in dealing with the past. Mm-hmm. We're still wrestling with that.
So talk to me a little bit about how you made the choice to pursue peace building. Yeah. It's an uncommon choice for people who grew up in your context.
Yeah. I kind of, sort of moving towards the sort of religious aspect of that, I kind of very faithfully went to an Anglican church or Episcopal church in your space from the age of 4 to the age of 16. And after that, I kind of just moved away from church. And to quote an American theologian, I suppose I became a happy pagan for a number of years. And I was then introduced to C.S. Lewis by a friend whom I work with, and read a lot of Lewis's books, read a lot from the other side of the tracks, people like Bertrand Russell and others, Why I'm Not a Christian, but eventually became convinced of this. And I suppose I often quote C.S. Lewis's great quotation where he eventually embraced Christianity, where he says, I was dragged kicking and screaming into the kingdom of God, probably the most reluctant convert in all of England. And I think in many ways that probably described my journey into that space. I mean, interestingly, Bree, I still, even at my age, I still play squash at a rugby club in East Belfast, and I see C.S. Lewis's house, his boyhood home, literally every Tuesday evening, because it's literally just like 20 meters across from my squash club. And interestingly, in 1998, which was the 100th year anniversary of Lewis's birth, there was a major conference at Queen's University, and the owners of the house actually opened it up just to a small group of people, and we were able to see that famous attic that Lewis wrote about so many times in his memoirs.
Mm-hmm. So, were you ever tempted to join the fight in a different way? Were you ever tempted?
No, again, I mean, I remember we in 1972, we had a terrorist incident every 40 minutes. So I remember as a kind of young boy going to sleep with kind of bombings and shootings in the distance. And I remember a boy in my class, a boy called John Dugan. So we had Bloody Sunday, but we had also Bloody Friday, where the IRA planted 9 indiscriminate bombs across Belfast and killed a significant number of individuals. And I remember John, he made the decision, and as I often say there, Brie, when you spill into these spaces, you always need a little bit of what I call like toxic religion to justify your decision. So the kind of swearing-in process for many of these were a Bible in one hand and a pistol in the other. You always need that sort of God is on your side mentality to kind of justify what you're doing. And I suppose it probably did cross my mind, should I do this, should I not? But I didn't. And people, again, love to spiritualize this. Invariably, when you tell this story in churches, many people say, pretty simplistically, mind you, oh, I think God definitely had his hand on you. I don't know, Brie, there's many people theologically trained in this room, but is there such a thing as a theology of luck? I don't know. But it didn't happen to me. Mm-hmm. But to other people who were no different to me, they made those decisions.
So what was the work that you did in peace building? What was it that you did to help bring about the Good Friday Accords, to build some degree of conversation amongst paramilitaries to be willing to sit and talk?
Yeah. I suppose in the late 1980s, I was ordained, seems a lifetime ago now, in 1987. And I was the youngest of a very, very small group of clergy that really began dialogue with those who were pursuing political violence. And I suppose asking the question as well, how do we use sacred space? I mean, I also want to ask my academic colleagues here as well, the University of Chicago, how do you use academic space as well? Because sometimes, if we're honest, both academia and church, we end up with this like fusty, musty, dusty, rarefied atmosphere that never really spills out and makes a difference in the public space. So a number of us are asking the question, how do we use sacred space well? And at that stage, from 92 to 99, myself and a Catholic Dominican sister, Noreen Christian, who had actually spent 25 years in the struggle against apartheid, we began to set up really on an interface those walls, those kind of Berlin-type walls, Brie, that you saw when you were with me in Belfast a few years ago. We had a church literally right in an interface. And we also bought a few houses and tried to create a mixed ecumenical community, allowing people at that stage to have comfortable conversations. Now, this was before the ceasefires in 1994. So I'm thinking October 1993 was a very difficult time, and I'll just highlight a story that illustrates that. These things are kind of tattooed in your skull. At 1:30 p.m. on October 23rd, 1993, I had a phone call to my manse, as we called it, or parsonage, as you call it in the US context, to say that a bomb had gone off literally a mile or less from my Springfield Road Methodist Church. It was known as the Shankill bombing. It's a name I guess many of you know. I went on to the Shankill Road, knew there were a number of casualties, left the Shankill to go to the Mater Hospital. And as I was coming out of the Mater Hospital, a young man, Google him later, called Alan McBride, just 28 years of age, was coming out of the hospital. And he put his arms around me and he said, she's gone, she's gone. His wife Sharon and Sharon's father had died in that bombing. Now, I co-officiated at their wedding just several years earlier, probably 1986, 1987. I was kind of training for ministry, and the minister I was under at that particular stage asked me to share in that service. I remember that evening being in the Royal Victoria Hospital beside a woman called Wilma McKee. She was early 40s. So this bombing happened on a Saturday, and on the Friday, she had literally got the all clear for cancer, and then was caught tragically in this bombing, and very severe injuries. I remember being at her bedside, and the consultant saying, she's probably 4 hours to live. And leaving that sort of tiny hospital room, going out to her mum, her dad, her 14-year-old and 12-year-old son, and her husband. And even today, Brie, I can tell you exactly the colour of the suit I had on that day, the colour of my clerical collar, the colour of the walls were painted in that hospital corridor. So I suppose in some way I've never suffered from extreme like trauma or depression, but there's still something there that takes me back in time. You know, that length of time, nearly 29 years now, to remember the kind of graphics of that. And I suppose at those days, in many ways, then obviously it was the IRA planted that bomb, those in the pro-British Unionist side responded. And that week was a traumatic week, really trying to beg people to stop killing one another. I think once we got the ceasefires, it gave us a breathing space because people realised there was a slight window as we moved towards the Good Friday Agreement. And people have often asked me, should religious leaders talk to people who pursue violence? My answer to that has always been categorically yes. And I'll give you a kind of homemade quotation. It kind of sort of doesn't say much about my gender as a male, but I'm quite prepared to say it. If you lock 40 men in a room, listening to their own reassuring voices, it's a recipe for disaster. And the problem was there were so many echo chambers over that island of Ireland where people who were pursuing political violence were not, I would have argued, being given, first of all, what I call alternatives or a moral framework to move out of this. All through the 1990s, there were conversations going internally, particularly within the IRA. Do we continue what they call the armed struggle? And gradually they moved to what they called the kind of ballot box in one hand and the Armalite in the other. So the key for many religious actors was to persuade them to move towards political goals. So literally kind of drop the Armalite and move towards political struggle rather than armed struggle. And I can move on to that and tell you some stories if that's helpful. So to give you a couple of stories out of that. Ceasefires occur in 1994. So people, both the British, Irish and American administrations had to ask the question, we have a window here to possibly get people over the line. The American administration, Bill Clinton, made a decision to give Gerry Adams a visa for 48 hours. Now, I can tell you this categorically, both the American Secretary of State and the State Department and the British government went ballistic, feeling this was a bad move. People had said to Clinton, this could wreck a presidency, which has literally only begun. But Clinton was in constant correspondence with Albert Reynolds, who was the Irish Taoiseach, and Reynolds, reading the situation, felt that he had to empower the Doves, particularly within the Republican movement, within the IRA, to move away from political violence. So Adams came to to the US, Boston, New York, Irish America. Then Bill Clinton did a visit to Belfast in November 95. He actually did his keynote address literally 100 meters in a building behind my church. Left that building and went down, these roads are nameless to you, but just to illustrate my mind, down to Springfield Road, turned left Brie onto the Falls Road, and Gerry Adams coincidentally just happened to be coming out of the bakery as Bill was passing with his little bag of morning scones. Clinton's cavalcade stopped, and Clinton got out and publicly shook Adams' hand. Now, think of that. Even in the context of what's going on in some world spaces today. Here is the leader of the largest democracy on planet Earth, the leader of the free world, shaking the hand of the spokesperson for the most lethal terrorist organization in Western Europe. So people had a right to say, what the hell are you doing? But Clinton was smart. Because Clinton knew there was a struggle going on for the soul of the IRA, and he had to empower those who were wanting to move him away from political violence. So you can imagine when Adams, McGuinness and others within the IRA Army Council went back to the hard men of the IRA, they were saying, this is what you get when you move towards political struggle rather than armed struggle. And I suppose all the time behind the scenes, Brie, people like myself and others were trying to ensure that those within loyalist groupings and Republican groupings were seeing there was a way out of this. And really, in reality, the Good Friday Agreement created a win-win situation for every person. I often say there's kind of three types of peace process. You have Sri Lanka, where the government military forces crush the Tamil Tigers completely. So there's no peace agreement, there's no negotiations. But there's no one in this room tonight or listening to me on live stream can say to me, Gary, I can tell you categorically the Tamil Tigers will never rise again. No one knows that. Because if memory, as we've often discussed, Brie, is anything to go by, memories are passed from generation to generation, the stories, the hurt, the pain. I suppose the next is really South Africa, where you get kind of colonial regime change at the top, so you kind of dismantle apartheid. But in many ways, there hasn't been a big economic benefit to South Africa. Jacob Zuma, others, major corruption. The hope is that Cyril Ramaphosa will get to grips with that. But violence, we had some black activists there in Belfast a few years ago, and they were saying sexual crime against women in townships, record highs, against LGBTQ community at record highs. So there's still a journey in that process. The Good Friday Agreement was a second preference peace process, where George Mitchell very cleverly tried to create a win-win situation for every person that was at the table. So there was no humiliation of the other side. There was no demeaning of the other side. Enough sides that were sitting in those opposite spaces, Brie, were able to go and sell this to their constituency. And as I alluded to the other, it's that word, compromise. But sometimes we've actually made a dirty word. Let's be honest, all of us in this room, most of our lives and relationships work because of compromise. My marriage works, I can assure you, because of compromise. My relationship with our 4 kids work because of compromise. So why is it that compromise in American politics, British-Irish politics at the moment, Israeli-Palestinian politics, Russia-Ukraine, we've made compromise a dirty word?
Before we get to the implementation of the Good Friday Accord, I'd like to understand a little bit of the contours of the conversations that you had with paramilitaries, people who were fighting, the way that you moved them into a political, or helped them realize a political solution was viable as opposed to a violent solution. What resources did you draw upon to enable that, and why were you able to do it? What made having somebody who is of that side, an internal negotiator, an effective role for you to play?
There's been a lot written lately, Brie, on what people are calling inside mediation. And we can come to Israeli-Palestinian theatre if you want eventually, because I know a number of sheikhs, imams and rabbis are trying to do that, particularly in the mixed cities in Jerusalem, what they call inside mediation. So working on the theory as well, that people that are on the inside, or kind of, to quote the quote Isaiah, kind of bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, who are aware of those situations. There's no question about it, those early days, it was not champagne corks popping or hugs and kisses. There were some very, very, very difficult conversations. There was no trust in the room. And really, trust, I've often said, in those fragmented spaces only came about in the context of meaningful relationships. So I'd often find that even though there's maybe a group of up to 10, 15 people in a room, sometimes quiet coffees, quiet beers together, kind of off the scene, allowed those relationships to ferment and actually be delivered. I think also, hopefully, religion is not perfect, and I'm not here to argue that. I think from the Christian perspective, the church has a pretty bloody, barbaric history at times, and anyone that denies that's just fooling themselves. But I do think certain religious actors who are on the ground can create spaces or a moral framework to allow people to consider alternatives. And I think, as I was saying there earlier, these people were simply echo chambers. I suppose some of the things we looked like was asking questions like, how do you see the future? Does compromise, what does that look like? And I suppose both the Irish, British and American administration, in conjunction with other people like myself and academics and business people, were trying to use us. The kind of technical phrase was interlocutors. Probably I more put it simply like in medical terms. We were like sticking a thermometer into someone's mouth and taking a reading. Is this person lying to me? Are they telling the truth? And we were trying to create a context where we were reporting that back to people. And interesting, in the early 1990s, Peter Brooke, who was the British Secretary of State, made a statement that really signalled, I think, particularly to the IRA and the Republican movement, that there was a way to move forward in this that would allow them to pursue peaceful politics. It was made in some, it wasn't even made in a political forum, it was made at a dinner somewhere in London of some ancient club that had absolutely nothing to do with politics, but it was all choreographed. So Peter Brook said, as a British government, we have no selfic, economic or strategic interests in Northern Ireland. He said, it is not against a united Ireland we set our face, but against the means that people are pursuing through violence to pursue a united Ireland. Those kind of statements gave confidence. So really what I would have said there, Bree, there was a private conversation that allowed eventual public conversations to take place. Now the key in this all is, for anyone involved in negotiations, is it's when do you make the private public? Mm-hmm. So it's really knowing that you've got enough key actors that can move people in the right direction and create a critical mass of civic society to buy into the direction of what they're going. And perhaps again, one of the best illustrations in moving the IRA and the loyalist groupings towards ceasefires and eventually decommissioning of weapons. I mean, it's like, so this is a good city to tell this illustration in. So think of the highest building in Chicago, okay? Think of going into that building and turning off the lights one switch at a time. These conversations took forever. You were not going in, there was one meeting, proposed second that we were out. There were small meetings, town hall meetings, as you call them in the American context. I mean, because people for 30 years had watched family members on both sides, British soldiers had died. People weren't moving necessarily towards any form of forgiveness mode. People, for quite a while, were looking for victory. But we ended up in the 1990s, and I think, Bree, this is probably one of the most key phrases of all. We simply had a mutually hurting stalemate. A mutually hurting stalemate. So, I mean, the British Army, if you want to Google the top 10 armies in the world, the Brits are in there, as are the Americans, the Israelis, Russians, Pakistan, India, and a number of others. But the British Army were not going to defeat the IRA. There was absolutely no way the IRA were ever going to defeat one of the most efficient military machines in the world. And the loyalist groupings were not going to defeat the IRA. So there emerged, I guess, late 80s, early 90s, a number of people, military people, business people, academics, religious actors, who were saying, we need to find another way to do this. I mean, that was impossible in the 70s. It was impossible through most of the 80s. And I think the other key thing as we spilled into the mid-90s, Bree, was personalities. It was Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, British Prime Minister, and Bertie Ahern, the Irish Prime Minister. So there was leadership in the public space. So you had political leadership there, you had religious leadership, you had business people saying, we need to piece this back together, and academics were saying, there is a way through this. So in many ways, a number of disciplines came together around this mutually hurting stalemate.
When the Good Friday Accords are signed, when decommissioning of weapons happens, oftentimes that's looked at as the victory. Yeah. But that's just the turning point into the creating this sort of conditions for some kind of sustainable and fragile peace. So what has your work been since that?
I mean, being honest, I think the work from the Good Friday Agreement has probably been more difficult. There's a theory, a colleague of mine, a sociologist in Queen's University, talks about the political peace process, Bree, versus the social peace process. Politicians, bless them, I have many political friends, politicians work on the assumption that once the deal is done, societal healing automatically follows. And in reality, nothing could be further from the truth. So don't work on the assumption like helicopters take off from the lawn of the White House or the Champs-Élysées or the Knesset, Jerusalem, Ramallah, wherever, that the deal is done. I mean, Mitchell's words, implementing this has been long and protracted. Prison releases, police reform and weapons decommissioning were the three main pillars of the Good Friday Agreement. Prison releases, by and large, took place inside 2 years. Now, that was difficult. I mean, you can imagine people walking out of a number of prisons in the northern part of Ireland with a hell of a lot of blood in their hands. And to give credit to many, many victims' families, for them that was a price worth paying in the belief that this would bring a sustainable peace to the island of Ireland. Weapons decommissioning was again meant to take place inside 2 years. The IRA didn't decommission their weapons to 2005-2006, loyalist groupings again until 2009. A couple of things around that. Both the IRA and the loyalist groupings felt the decommissioning word was a word of humiliation. And one particular right-wing fundamentalist preacher, who you will know but I will not name, was wanting the IRA, quoting kind of Old Testament or Hebrew Bible terminology, he was wanting them to repent and weep and tear their clothes with sackcloth and ashes. I mean, that wasn't going to work. So the IRA and the Republican movement cleverly called it putting our weapons beyond use. The loyalist groupings cleverly called it putting weapons beyond reach. In reality, was decommissioning important or not important? It was probably important as a confidence-building measure. But as you folk know, particularly living in this space, weapons, sadly, on planet Earth are quite accessible. And I mean, I think as the late John Hume said, it's not decommissioning of weapons we need, it's decommissioning of people's minds, which was much more important. There was a mindset that had to change. Hopefully, Bree, that gave confidence. I mean, the Ulster Volunteer Force, that were the most lethal paramilitary group on the pro-British side, non-state actors, I mean, they were designated as an illegal terrorist group, and the Red Hand Commando read their weapons decommissioning statement in the last Saturday in June 2009 at my church building. And you can imagine, from some religious critics, particularly those who are holier than thou and on the right of right, I got it on the neck considerably, but I just simply quoted text in the book of Isaiah and said, I think there are verses in there that talk about like swords being beaten into plowshares, etc., etc. And if that is true, I actually can't think of a more fitting place to read out from a group who's been involved in political violence to say, our weapons have gone. The implementation of the agreement, reform of policing has been very successful. Absolutely no question about that. And I mean, I know there are many conversations between numerous police forces, of which a number in the US have had conversations on how that reform of policing took place. So the kind of key phraseology there, Bree, now is not policing the community, but policing with the community. So we would have a policing board for Northern Ireland that really holds the police accountable. Politicians, but also a number of people from civic society. And it's interestingly now, when police come together, for example, to look at demonstrations or protests, this is factual, the first question on the agenda is, how do we protect a person's human rights? So I mean, that is how far policing has moved in our space through the Good Friday Agreement. Bree, legacy, memory, wasn't in there. And I mean, I think no one will ever be able to answer this question. If they had to put too much dealing with legacy or victims, would Mitchell have got the whole thing over the line? But it has bedeviled us, because here we are, 24 years later, and we still have not got an architecture for dealing with the past.
That's what struck me so much when I was visiting your place. This huge economic development corporation, right, in Belfast, in the inner city, and it's a gorgeous building. And then you walk around the corner, and what do you see but visual memory, sort of a memorialization of violence. And it's not just about victims. It's about people who are calling you towards political violence on one corner, and then a sort of visual contestation of memory of a different sort. Two murals that sort of always stand out to me. Two guys in ski masks and AK-47 saying it is your right to defend yourself, and then around the other corner is a picture of the Titanic. So a sort of trying to create a different visual identity for a neighborhood, but how can you be 5 and not walk around the corner to the store and see these things and be traumatized, right, by a memory that you didn't live?
I often say there are I will never ever do another PhD at my age, but if I was, for some of you younger folk in the room, I would do it in the role of religion and memory. I mean, let me tell you a couple of stories, okay? There's a New York journalist, David Reef, who wrote a book called In Praise of Forgetting. He also wrote one of the Guardian long reads called The Cult of Memory, When History Does More Harm Than Good. So it's a very graphic illustration in that, Brie, where he talks about being in Yugoslavia when the Balkans is kind of imploding in the early 1990s. And he's in this room with a bunch of Serbian nationalists. He goes outside, this Serbian nationalist comes out after him, shoves a piece of paper in his hand, he opens it up, there's some obscure date, 1483, 1503. He goes back into the room and says, like, what is this? It was the Battle of Kosovo or the Battle of Constantinople. The Serbs lost the Battle of Kosovo. But one Serbian nationalist said, you take away the Battle of Kosovo, you take away the soul of the Serbian nation. 600 years later, so this is how powerful memory is. 600 years later, they used that as justification for the genocide of 10,000 Bosnian Muslims. But let me bring it up to speed. Vladimir Putin. As you know, or maybe not, you've seen that beautiful bare chest of his, I'm sure, many times, but Putin wears a cross around his neck. Putin's mother was a Christian, father was an atheist. He was baptized secretly. And many of us in the West were scratching our heads when this all began, saying, what is so important about Kiev? 988, Vladimir the Rus was converted to Christianity and insisted that the whole city of Kiev be baptized and become Christian. So that is why Kiev is so important, particularly when the Russian Orthodox Church broke away in 2019. I was speaking in a church in Georgia a few weeks ago and was able to show a photo of Vladimir in the pulpit flanked by 2 senior Russian Orthodox dignitaries. So I often say, Brie, as you know, when things go wrong, if invariably you've got identity, land, and religion are bubbling somewhere above or below the surface. And it was the same in our space as well. So that kind of, you know, there's an American historian whose name just slips my mind, but he talks about the terror of remembering versus the terror of forgetting. So there's no way I'm going to say tonight to many African American colleagues and people of colour, just forget about slavery. I mean, that's another legacy that I would be arguing that America needs to grapple with and wrestle with. Any more than I'm going to say to a Jewish colleague, forget about the Holocaust. But how do you remember and how do you forget? Because if we're constantly passing these dates down from generation to generation. So, like in my space, I mean, my wife Joyce, my colleague McGann, who worked with me in the early 90s in Belfast, dates are tattooed on your skull. 1641, 1690, 1798, 1801, 1912, 1916. I mean, you just rhyme them continually off. So some historian, tongue-in-cheek said, but it'll bring a smile to your face, he said, I think we should build a monument to amnesia in Ireland and then forget where we put it, because we're still obsessed with the past. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I kind of say to sort of academic and religious colleagues in this room, how do we deal with that? What does that look like? I mean, you know, Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa was reasonably successful. Some people that were involved in it, a couple whom I know well enough, think it was like brilliantly successful. It was reasonably successful. But how do we deal with that? I mean, I remember being in Jerusalem at a dialogue with a number of Palestinians, Israelis, and other international people. Bishop John was there, the guy who chaired their reconciliation process in Rwanda. And, you know, I mean, I don't want to say I was cynical, but the stories, and I asked myself, like, really? Have people moved that far so quickly? Maybe I'm just being cynical. Has forgiveness happened a year after someone like sliced your brother's head off? How do we deal with that? So I'm definitely not coming with a kind of points 1 to 10 to deal with this. But it's how we create a space, I think, Brie, in your space and my space, where it allows people to deal with the past, but we're not dominated by the past. But the problem in the Irish context is the past is always in the present and sometimes is shaping the future quite considerably. And with Brexit and other bits and pieces, which I imagine we'll come to, from my perspective, being a pro-European, I think has set us back considerably.
So it leads naturally to ask about what happens with Brexit, what happens to a potential hard border, what happens to the work that was done. Are these going to become new dates in a long history of recitation, or is there any desire for a different outcome, a social peace in addition to a political one that's become compromised?
I mean, Brexit, to me, many Brexiteers will disagree with me, and I'm happy that they do. To me, Brexit was about identity. For many people, about English nationalism. Think maybe Christian nationalism in this little American space. Identity politics has gripped your space, as it's gripped my space, as it grips many other spaces as well. So for me, Brexit for many people was about the other, the outsider, coming in to this space. The difficulty for us in that northern part of Ireland was that the Good Friday Agreement had attempted to blur identity. So, for those who grew up in the Catholic Irish nationalist tradition, a united Ireland was not necessarily on the horizon, but they knew within the Good Friday Agreement one of the key things was called the principle of consent. So when a majority in Northern Ireland, the north of Ireland, want a united Ireland, that comes about through a border poll. Mm-hmm. The problem with Brexit was it talked about borders. Many people's identity who saw themselves as liberal, Catholic, Irish nationalists, they felt, you've just ripped my European identity away overnight. And you've made this space, to my mind, a more Britishy type of space. And so that win-win situation that George Mitchell created where identity was blurred. So in my context, I hold a British passport, I hold an Irish passport, I still see myself as a European. But for many people, the rug was just trailed out from under their feet. So that has really pressed the fast forward button, particularly for people who were more middle of the road, who saw Northern Irish unionist politics shifting towards the right, and particularly moving towards supporting the Conservative Party and what was a hard Brexit, rather than what could have been a soft, more flexible Brexit, which could have kept more people at the table. So, I was emailing a couple of colleagues here because we have an election in Northern Ireland on the 5th of May where Sinn Féin could end up with being the largest party. So, but here's the irony of our politics. You've probably about 40% who designate loosely as unionists, 40% as nationalists, and a growing 20% Brie who designate as other, who are sick to the back teeth of toxic constitutional politics and want to concentrate on other issues. It is that liberal 20% in the middle who will decide the future of Northern Ireland. So it's not going to be the people painting the murals or those running about with AK-47s or flying flags. It's going to be this liberal, so it's my kids, it's that group who are going to decide what is the way forward in relation to that. Mm-hmm. But identity politics is still sadly alive and well in our space, and a number of us are trying to hold that middle ground. I mean, the conversation I had this morning with two colleagues, I chair this island-wide dialogue group of about 60 people, trying to bring people together for what are pretty uncomfortable conversations, but trying to apply that social peace process that's saying that civic actors, so I do argue that people like us in this room are really the people that make a difference. And people often used to say to me, Brian, I know I mentioned this to you, we had no government because Sinn Féin stepped out of the government. Their turn was kind of 2017 to 2020. Now the Democratic Unionist Party, quite a right-of-centre unionist party, they have pulled the executive down, not all the government, a certain strand of it. But I've often said, as people like us in this room need to hold those spaces together. Because from 2017 to 2020, when we had no functioning government, people used to say to me, Gary, why have you not gone back to conflict? And I often used to say, Brie, civic society is the social glue that holds the peace process together. I mean, some of the work I'm doing here, just to not ignore the American context, I mean, I'm doing work with the Carter Center in Atlanta at the moment, also the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy in Washington, D.C. Now, those two organizations, for the first time in their history, are working internally in the United States because of the strains within your political system, and trying to get Republicans and Democrats, to use my phraseology, to disagree well. And I think it's crucial that academia also needs to be part of that process. And I've said the number, I mean, Carter's working with a number of kind of religious actors as well, and I said you need to pull other people into these spaces to facilitate these conversations, painful as they may be.
It seems like in our context that is increasingly not something that is looked at as being positive, right? I can hear the argument about it. In fact, when I first started doing work between communities in the late 90s, I think it was considered something that people approached with some degree of curiosity. And now I think it's met with a deep degree of cynicism, right? Or skepticism at the very best. That to work with people who are fundamentally different is curious, as opposed to now where it seems like it is a betrayal, right? So there's something in our politics and that may be a very rational response, right? It may be a very rational response to the material and political conditions that are in the United States. So how do you even begin when that's the default, when the skepticism about that is so pervasive that people question your ability to be authentically on whatever side it is when you're in conversation with somebody who's different?
I think with the right leadership it is doable. I mean, 2 weeks ago tomorrow, no names, I was with the Carter Center, had dinner with a number of Republicans and Democrats in Georgia who are willing to have these conversations. The key really is a lot of this has to be private for now, because the public climate, as I read your situation, and this new folk are a better place than I am, I don't think it's probably right for a major conversation at the moment. But I do think places like this and others need to facilitate those. I remember, Brian, you know this story, I think it was 2014, a theologian in Union Theological Seminary in Upper West Side just had this kind of throwaway line in a blog that I responded to where he said, no one in the United States wants to talk about the legacy of slavery. So there's a really interesting S word, i.e. the S word slavery. Let me tell you about mine. It's called sectarianism. I said, and I grew up in a space where no one wanted to wrestle with the legacy of sectarianism, and we ended up spilling into a bloody civil war. Of course, I continued, Brie, and I said, I'm not suggesting that America is moving towards a civil war. I'm not sure I could write that today, because even before your last election, both conservative and liberal commentators were openly writing in some leading newspapers in this nation, could this actually happen? And as I looked at the Capitol building there of the 6th of January, and I've done this, I mean, I did this last, 2 weeks ago, Joyce, in a church in the Deep South, which was, both Republicans and Democrats there. And I said, look, as an outsider looking in, let me kind of tell you my take on this. And I said, to those who are Republicans in this room, I am not saying you don't have a right to demonstrate. So in any democracy, every single person has the right to peaceful protest. That is just a fact and enshrined in anyone's constitution. So I then asked them a question, because I've often been told by churches, Gary, don't mention Clinton, Biden or Trump in the pulpit, you will split the church. So I had to think outside the box here, Bree. So here's the way I did this. So I said to this group of Georgian Republicans and Democrats, I says, tell me, is there anyone in here had a relative fought in the Second World War? So obviously around the church. So I said, let me tell you my relative Second World War story. I said, it's about my Uncle Jimmy, who as a little boy taught me to swim. I said, I did his funeral at the age of 82, a number of years ago. And I said, my Uncle Jimmy was rescued in the English Channel, Dunkirk, when the Nazis pushed the British forces into the English Channel. I said, he actually went back in again on the second day of D-Day I said, I may have perhaps fought alongside some of your great uncles, great aunts, grandparents. I don't know. So I was using a bit of psychology here, Bree. So I brought everyone into my space. Because everyone was in agreement that the defeat of Nazism was absolutely crucial. I said, so I'm saying as I looked at the Capitol building on January the 6th, I have no difficulty with people protesting. However, I said, I actually do have difficulty with a cross 20 yards from a gallows. I said, I also have difficulty with two people running about, and there were others, but two that I did see, with a t-shirt on that said, Camp Auschwitz. And another person who had a t-shirt on that said 6MNWE. No one seems to know about this, but it was 6 million Jews were not enough. So I says, I really want to press the pause button there, because I can assure you my Uncle Jimmy and your grandparents and aunts and uncles, etc., actually didn't die for people to be walking about the largest democracy on planet Earth asking for another Holocaust. And I said, I think you need to press the pause button. So I think there's another way, Bree, to bring people into those spaces, difficult as it may be. My concern is, if things go badly wrong here, and I often use our own space as an illustration, when British troops come on our streets in August '69, the common wisdom of the day was, this'll all be over by Christmas. It didn't finish officially until 2005. It was the longest military operation in British history, and as we all know in this room, the Brits have fought a fair amount of battles in their history, as we all know. My concern is, if you spill into something, it's very, very difficult to stop. And as you know, the amount of weaponry that's in your space at the moment as well could just lead to a bloodbath. So if you're asking me as an outsider, by all means disagree, I don't mind, looking in, I think people like yourselves of goodwill and others listening in here, I don't think you can ignore this and turn a blind eye, because your politics at the moment is difficult. And I think for the future of your children and grandchildren, you need to address these, rather than kind of, as we did in the 50s and 60s, when I guess any sensible outside observer could see there was stuff bubbling there below the surface, but there was a kind of, it may be all right. It ended up it wasn't all right. I hope in your space, categorically, it is all right. But if there's even a minimalistic chance, Bree, that it's not all right, I think business people, academics, etc., and I think you do need a multidisciplinary approach to this. I mean, I often argue, if I take an illness tonight and I end up in some brilliant Chicago hospital, I know for a fact I'm going to be under a multidisciplinary team. So don't leave this just to religious people. You need religious people, you need women's groups, you need business people, you need academics, you need alliances of people to move into their particular spaces to move people in the right direction. If there's an alternative, tell me.
I think at that it's a good place to pause and bring our audience in for questions. So there is a mic going around if anybody has a question to ask you.
A couple of investment bankers who work at Harvard Business School, and they wrote a wonderful book a few years ago about setting the table.
Yeah.
For hard negotiations.
Yeah.
What's your, I think you're exactly right. You get into these hard issues, you don't just sit down, and there's so much resistance. So how in your experience, what are the kind of practices you and other religious groups in particular have experimented with to set the table, to build a little trust before you
Okay.
start?
Yeah. And a lot of it, I mean, I do work at Harvard. I'm not, as I said, we will not get near the Israeli-Palestinian theatre, or we will be here to midnight, and I'll be sending McGann go out and get a few pints of Guinness. We're going to be here forever. In a sense, I've had 1,000 Israeli Palestinians in Belfast with me in the last 10 years. A lot of it is very much under the radar, and that Harvard negotiation program has been part of that. So you know all those books, Getting to Yes, etc., have been there. A lot of it initially is about relationships. So I mean, I have it hard right with us, centrists, those who are on the left as well, trying to bring them in to those spaces. to look at other conflicts. It was interestingly in our space I was in South Africa, and seems this is a lifetime ago, September 1991, and a few years later, a group of Unionist Nationalist Republicans went to South Africa. Not to say that the South Africa blueprint would work in the Irish space. I mean, I'll tell you how bad it was. The Unionists refused to fly on the same plane as the Nationalists, wouldn't travel in the same blinking buses when they were in South Africa, but they came back with a possibility, I would have said, that maybe, just maybe. Because I've often said, if we were having this conversation in the early 1990s, the three big conflicts were South Africa, Palestine, Israel, and the Irish. Most people assumed the Palestinians and Israelis perhaps were over the line with the Oslo Accords. There's a possibility. I mean, we could critique that. There's 101 reasons we know that failed. South Africa was painfully moving out of apartheid, and those cursed Irish were still killing one another. So here we are 30 years later. And the Irish peace process, I would argue, has been the most successful. And I think a lot of it was with back channels and relationships that were built quietly, and trusted relationships that were built. And interestingly, I mean, when Israelis and Palestinians are in our space, both of them are saying this, and not dwell on this too much, Brie. They say to me, Gary, we come away with 5 lessons from your space. The first one is political leadership is essential to achieving peace. Now, I'm not going to get into debate tonight about Palestinian or Israeli leadership, or we will be here all night, but I do want to say that some of our politicians literally took very strategic risks, but actually put their life in the line for peace. So, I mean, both Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, if the kind of hard men of republicanism hadn't have agreed with what they were doing, it was bang. So there was some key, what I call strategic, thoughtful, risky leadership took place within republicanism. The second thing, as often said, was the futility of violence. That people realised this has been going on for 400 years. The IRA had enough weapons and arms dumps to continue this for another 50 years. I mean, the dear Colonel Gaddafi's massive arms shipment from Libya that could have sustained that war for another 30 plus years. But I think a number of key leaders, religiously, academics, women's groups, etc., realised that we need to lift this up or we're going to be cursed for another 50 years. Israelis and Palestinians say to me continually, Gary, you don't understand. I say, tell me what I not understand. We don't trust one another. And I said, do you really think that in the late 1980s, when a number of us went into some difficult, darkened rooms in certain spaces in Belfast, as I said earlier, it was all hugs and kisses? People hated each other in that room. And I would say to Palestinians and Israelis, you can't use lack of trust as an excuse for not beginning the process. The fourth thing that often comes up is security, particularly from the Israeli side. We want to feel secure in this space, etc., etc., etc. And as I mentioned, I went through the whole concept of efficient armies. We only got real security in Ireland when we dealt with the root causes of the conflict. And so that's crucial for people within the Israeli side to hear that. Real peace came about when we dealt with the root causes of the conflict, which were many. And the fifth lesson is the role of civic society. And we also need, I mean, I'm doing a project at the moment with the United States Institute for Peace. They have a major project ongoing, the role of women in peace building. I mean, the society I came from was pretty dominated by some pretty men with pretty extreme views, to put it mildly. But in the lead up to the Good Friday Agreement, my good friend Monica McWilliams, who many of you know, professor, expert, world expert on transitional justice, they formed a women's coalition party of all women, and 2 of them got elected. And that softened some of that alpha male attitude that often takes place. So it's crucial that women are at the table in those negotiations. I mean, multitudes of research show that there is more chance of peace processes holding where women are involved in the negotiations leading up to these negotiations. Liberia is another example. I mean, the movement in Israel, Women Wage Peace, who have been with us in Belfast, there now is a movement literally just started in Palestine, 3-4 weeks ago now, Joyce? I think it's called Women of the Sun. So I just think, Bria, it's creating those spaces for negotiation, and it's also realizing that a good negotiator is always looking at what the opposite person needs to bring his constituency on board. The problem is sometimes your politics, my politics, is about humiliating the other instead of ensuring that the other gets enough to get their constituency over the line and they can sell it to them. That was a long answer. Sorry, Tiffany.
Can you hear me okay? Thanks for that. I'm going to follow up on what Steve asked.
Okay.
I've got a couple MDiv students in the room, and I just did a chaplaincy unit at a hospital last summer. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the difficult private conversations that you had before the public conversation. And I heard you use a little bit in that discussion of the Georgian Republicans sort of talking about legacy right away. Legacy and memory. So yeah, if you could walk us through that, that would be really wonderful.
Just a simple question I often ask people, and I'm talking people who've had a significant amount of blood in their hands, and more this is more a one-to-one, because I mean these people, I mean they're male macho, they don't want to be like reasonably normal in front of their tough friends. So sometimes in private, and I suppose and I think sometimes religious actors forget this, we are still probably one of the few professions that can actually call their person's door and say, could I see you as a family? I mean, and that's a privilege that many, particularly in this world, don't have. And often being able to do that, particularly with some of these guys, and just asking them, how do you see the future? I mean, okay, you have a certain political aspiration, but what future do you hope for your kids, grandkids? And is there a way that those political aspirations could maybe be fulfilled, but you create a peaceful space for your children also? So it's humanizing that. I mean, a theologian once said, dehumanization precedes genocide. So even after that, then trying to bring them into quiet conversations with the person they wanted to kill. I mean, it's interesting now in some of the work I'm doing in the US and in the Middle East, to be able to bring people that 30 years ago wanted to take each other off planet Earth. Still not, I mean, this is not kind of utopia, but still saying, look, our political goals are different, but we really don't want to pursue these anymore through political violence. And I think we also had to get to a stage where people saw the futility of violence, but still honouring those who had died for the cause. And that's a tension holding that together. You had the futility of violence, where innocent people were killed in many occasions, but also trying to hold together the sacrifice of other people. So we have to realise, I mean, there's a TED talk there somewhere on YouTube called The Danger of the Single Narrative. We just had to realise there's a multiplicity of narratives. My narrative may be different than the other person's as how this began, how it finished, etc., but how do you at least, when you're moving towards peace, initially quietly begin to develop a shared narrative for the future? And I think a lot of that is done legislatively, through human rights, through civil rights, through equality, etc., as well, building all those new mechanisms in that strengthen any fragile peace process.
Thank you very much. I was very taken with your idea of when to remember and when to forget. But in that light, is there also some value maybe to using the Good Friday Accords to hold up at a time when, during Brexit, they're becoming more vulnerable, and to hold them up as a way, a continued sign to the Israeli-Palestinians? Strategic use of commemoration.
No, it's a great question. Listen, I had a conversation. I mean, my wife heard most of it because we're in a small Airbnb. Even in the Good Friday Agreement, I mean, let's assume, I mean, there's some people on the sort of unionist side are saying the Good Friday Agreement has to go. So let's assume if you renegotiate it, it's still going to have exactly the same shape. So it'll be the three components of the Good Friday Agreement were internal arrangements within Northern Ireland. In other words, how do Catholics, nationalists, Republicans, those who designated Irish, share this tiny space with British, Protestant, Unionist, Loyalists. That's still going to be there. The North-South relationship between Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, is still going to have to be there, and the East-West is still going to have to be there. The very geographical nature of those two pretty small islands ensures that we're always going to be colliding. This is not Iraq, this in the distance, or Afghanistan. The very geography means there's always going to have to be a structure around that. And I often say, to both Israelis and Palestinians, under no circumstances am I saying that the Good Friday Agreement is the blueprint for the Middle East. But there are certain concepts in that may be applicable, trying to create a win-win situation. I wrote an article, and if you want to Google it later, in the Times of Israel last May, and it was simply lessons from the NI peace process for the Middle East. For the first time in a long time, you had internal violence within the nation of Israel in what were called the mixed cities, where Arabs and Jews, so it was really neighbour killing neighbour. And in the article I was saying to a number of people on the Israeli side, I was saying, look, this is now up close and personal. You can contain Gaza. I don't deny that. You can contain the West Bank. This is neighbour killing neighbour. This is welcome to, this is like, and if you're not careful, you'll end up with a series of mini Belfast scattered all over that region. In late May, early June, a key group of people, the Abraham Initiative, who many of you would know, they're bringing a group of elected officials from those mixed cities to spend time in Belfast, just looking at some of those conversations around that and how we do that. And it's not, as I often say to people, it's not utopia, but there may be some lessons. Just a story there. In October, we had our first delegation with COVID, and with the last delegation in the Middle East was early February 2020, and then we all descended into 2 years of chaos. So our first delegation was October 2022. And I must say, both the Palestinians and Israelis that came were pretty downbeat and despondent about, is there a way forward? And I remember saying to them the first night, look, all I want you to do is you hear these stories, you make the applicability. All I want you to go away is saying 3 words, maybe, just maybe. So I suppose what I'm trying to do, it's almost as if someone has put in like a massive vacuum and sucked the oxygen of hope out of that region, where people say it's never going to change, it's always going to be like that. Phrases that I grew up with, like my grandmother would say, oh, this place will never change, it's always been like this, it always will be, etc., etc., etc. And I kind of said, that's all I want you to say. And on that last night, a number of those folk, and particularly a number of Palestinians said, Gary, maybe, just maybe. But for that maybe, just maybe to happen, we need, I believe, to train a new leader, a new generation of leaders in the Middle East in their 20s and 30s. So I have a program running, which I spent last night on. It's a young emerging leaders program that I've called comparative peace processes, where they're sharing. I am not sure, and if any of my Israeli or Palestinian friends watch this, I'm not sure my generation is going to be the one to make peace in the Middle East. But I do think we need to empower those in their 20s, 30s and 40s, who many of them are looking, is this what this is going to be like for another 100 years? I'm not saying this is an overnight phenomenon, but I think there's a growing group there. The peace camp in Israel has fallen on hard times. We all know that. So I suppose the question I'm asking is, how do you grow the centre ground there? And bring, because at the end of the day, like for our peace process, like we had to bring in our extremes to get this over the line. This was all not people holding hands singing Kumbaya around a campfire. We had to bring in some people, who had dedicated their lives to political violence. That was not an overnight phenomenon by any means. This lady here.
I think this will be our last one.
So I've been working, I'm doing an internship in community organizing.
Okay.
And I use the one-on-one format
Right.
that you talked about. And you talked a little bit about trust coming into the
Yeah.
conversation. But I was wondering, where does vulnerability come in?
Yeah.
And after doing a couple of one-on-one meetings, before there
mean, the question of vulnerability, yeah, I mean, I think it's an excellent question. I think sometimes, and this was, I would criticize religion quite a bit, our churches, by and large, are not vulnerable spaces. I think churches, I mean, I've done the religious thing like for 35 years, so I know it pretty well. I think sometimes churches are the most dishonest spaces on the planet. To be quite honest. I mean, I think the AA model is a better model where you stand up, my name is Gary, I'm an alcoholic, great, come in. Try that in the church, they'll fire you out in your arch. You know, that's the irony of it all. They couldn't cope with that degree of honesty. So I often ask in religious spaces, I mean, how do we create spaces that are vulnerable? I mean, within the Christian tradition, there are other people here of other traditions and people not practicing faith. But if you look at that kind of incarnation of Jesus, that is like vulnerability mega, in a sense. And yet we've almost made that kind of God is on our side mentality. I mean, in your space and in my side. I mean, the organisation Bree was referring to, their model was for God in Ulster. You know, God was on their side. So, I mean, going back to what you're saying, I think sometimes people like you have to take the lead. I did this thing, the BBC once, so I just used myself as a guinea pig, which I don't mind, doing a kind of BBC interview and mentioning that AA model. And I said, I'm happy enough to say, my name is Gary, and I'm a recovering sectarian bigot. Okay? So I grew up in a space where I was taught by both family and friends, don't trust the other. My grandmother, bless her, don't ever bring a Catholic girl in here. Tiny woman, but she'd sort me out. Now that world thankfully has changed. But I know this, if I had fallen in love with a Catholic, and I did date a few, didn't tell my granny in the 70s, she'd have murdered me. She'd put me out of her house, in a sense. That is the space. But then I tell this story in Emory University and everyone's shocked. And I look and say, hey, come on. Like, you had a lot of mixed race marriages in the 50s and 60s here in the States. It's almost as if, like, this place is kind of just fine. But, so 2% in the 70s were Catholics and Protestants. Dating, falling in love, whatever. And many who did had to actually go to England to get out of the place because it was a risky business. Today, I'm guessing it's between 20 to 25% are dating, living together, getting married, long-term relationships from either side. So it is changing, but it's slow. But I think people of your generation need to make themselves vulnerable, and I think don't repeat the mistakes of my generation. Because we weren't able to have those difficult conversations. And I agree your space is exactly the same. I used to have older clergy saying to me, oh, Gary, in the 1950s and 60s, our churches were full. I go, like, really? Well, like, what were you doing? And they kind of look at you with this kind of quizzical manner. Because your gift to my generation was a bloody sectarian war. Because they hadn't the courage to deal with the legacy of sectarianism. So the church was partly responsible for our conflict. And in your space as well, I mean, the legacy of slavery, I mean, I could speak enough for the next 2 hours. The legacy of slavery was an elaborate theological system that developed out of a doctrine called the Doctrine of Discovery, which was a papal bull in the 15th century, which basically gave white Europeans like me the opportunity to come to the New World and commit a genocide in the name of Jesus. So theology has contributed to this. And the sad thing I think about the church is they're always the last organisation to actually say, we got this wrong, and make themselves vulnerable. And yet they insist on telling people like myself, follow this vulnerable person who takes on human flesh. There's a kind of, to quote the good book of James, and I'll finish with this, a double-minded person is unstable in all their ways. So there's a bit of instability at times in what I call institutional religion. To put it mildly, my sermon is finished. That will do me, okay?
Well, I'd like to thank you, Gary, for a really probing and interesting evening, taking us through your work. Thanks for making time.
Listen, thank you for coming as well.